Good evening, everyone. My name is Tappy Lung, and on behalf of the U.S. China Strategic Studies Organization, I would like to welcome you all to our most highly anticipated event of the year, our USCSO Spring Conference. The U.S. China Strategic Studies Organization was founded in the winter of 2020 with a mission to provide accessible and nonpartisan analysis of U.S. China relations for students from students. Standing here today, as we prepare to analyze the future of US China relations in this room full of students and even more online, I am proud to say that we've succeeded, and we're only getting started. But alas, we are gathered here today not because of an organization or a fancy invitation or even the free food, but because of a shared interest and a deep passion to explore one of the world's most interesting, complex, and fascinating geopolitical relationships. And because to discuss it with us today, we have perhaps the best candidates possible. I'm beyond excited today to be joined by two of the world's leading experts on US China relations, the Elliott School of International Affairs, Professor David Shambaugh and Professor Robert Sutter. Tonight, our event will be moderated by Tianqu Zhang, who is a contributor at the U.S. China Strategic Studies Organization and a graduate school at the Trattenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration, studying public policy. Originally from Toronto, his primary areas of interest include technology and international security, comparative politics in East Asia, and political theory. Now, before we begin, I'd like to review a few administrative items. For audience members here in the City View room, please remember to keep your mask on at all times, unless you are actively eating or drinking during our refreshment period at the end of the program. If you would like to ask a question during the question and answer period, in-person audience members may raise their hand and a microphone will be brought to you once you have been called on. Live stream attendees may submit their questions via chat, and Skylar here will read them aloud. Please note that we'll be recording today's session so that those who could not join us tonight will be able to learn from our discussion. Without further ado, please give a round of applause to tonight's speakers, Professor Robert Sutter, Professor David Shambaugh, and our moderator, Tianqu Zhang.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tianqu. I will be your moderator today. Sitting beside me are our honorable panelists, Professor Shambaugh and Professor Sutter. Professor Shambaugh is a distinguished scholar in contemporary China and contemporary East Asia. He is the founding director of China Policy Program at our GW University and has written extensively on the subject, including 30 books and over 200 scholarly articles. I believe many of those who are training political science, including myself, have read his famous book, China Goes Global, The Partial Power. Professor Sutter is a professor of practice of international affairs at Elliott School. A PhD from Harvard, Sutter has published 22 books, 300 articles, and numerous government reports dealing with contemporary East Asia and US-China policy. As a distinguished policy practitioner, Professor Sutter involved work for Congressional Research Service, Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of State, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Thank you very much for joining us. This conference shall start with two opening statements from our panelists, first addressing the history of US-China relations since the 1970s, and the second discussing the contemporary US-China competition. Then we will move on to three subjects. First is US-China competition and economic coercion. Second is US-China security dilemma. And the third one is the US-China domestic politics on their bilateral relations. So without further ado, the floor is yours. Professor Shambaugh, you may address.
Well, thank you, Tianqi and Tappy, for the introductions and for organizing. All of those on the organizing committee. Meta, where is she? There she is. She's one of my students. I look out and I see many current and former students. That's encouraging. So nice to see you all again, and welcome this evening. And I just want to, I guess I'm one of the faculty advisors. I think Professor Sutter may also be a faculty advisor for your organization. So we just want to congratulate you on your annual conference and your activities and getting yourselves started. And you don't need a great deal of advice. I think you're doing pretty well. So we're glad to be participating in tonight's event. So in terms of just getting us started, I thought I would sort of take advantage of the fact that we've just passed last week the 50th anniversary of the very famous visit by former President Nixon to China. You guys don't remember that. You weren't around, but Professor Sutter and I remember that. I was 19 years old, and I remember watching it and being absolutely riveted and fascinated by it on television. And it may have had something to do with piquing my interest and curiosity in China, and hence China studies. There are other contributing factors, but you know, it's one of the most memorable things I remember as a young person watching, along with the landing on the moon, these two events. So you weren't present, but it was said to be the week that changed the world, right? And in many ways, it did change the world, I think. I've published something just this week, a couple things actually, with that title, trying to explain why and how it changed the world. But what I thought I'd do in terms of opening thoughts about the anniversary, using that to kind of look at where the U.S. China relationship is half a century later. The one distinguishing feature to me over that half century, 50 years is a long time. But the most distinguishing feature to my mind in U.S. China relations over 50 years is fluctuation. It has been anything but steady. It's been very unsteady and very fluctuant, and oscillations, up and down, back and forth. And the relationship has fluctuated from amity to enmity. There's considerable enmity today in the relationship. It's fluctuated from cooperation to competition, from friendship to hostility in several sectors, not completely, but nonetheless, it's notable in both countries. From trust to deep suspicions, from shared interests to divergent interests, from lack of connections between our two societies to actually quite deep interactions and connections among the people of our two societies, which is a good thing. And partial decoupling, first coupling and then now partial decoupling of our economies. So 50 years later, there's been obviously tremendous growth in the relationship as measured in a number of ways, including those of you in this room. Looking around would surmise that at least half of you in this room come from the People's Republic of China. You are living testimony to what President Nixon and Chairman Mao and Zhou Enlai set in train. You are amongst 364,000 Chinese students in American universities last academic year. So that's a very good thing. So there are positives and there are negatives, and we tonight can talk about both of those dimensions and kind of unpack the relationship. But generally speaking, I think the relationship has certainly grown. We have to kind of just take note of the different dimensions of interconnectivity of our two peoples and our two economies and our two institutions, both at the national governmental level and at state and even local levels, and amongst civil society and amongst media. So really the interconnectivity is perhaps the most distinguishing feature, and without it, the relationship would be more direly stressed than it already is. So the relationship today, you know, we have to be honest and recognize that it's not good. The situation's pretty bad, in fact. It's eroded, the relationship is eroded considerably. It's not completely broken, but it's extremely stressed and fractured. It could get worse, could get better. I'm going to in a minute by saying that this is the new normal, though. Get used to it. There's no going back to the honeymoon of cooperation, or what Americans call engagement. Those days are done. So what's to replace that is the question, and we can explore that in our conversation tonight. But in virtually every sector of the relationship that you examine, or one examines, one finds differences, deep differences. Politics and political systems, ideologies, commerce, human rights, academic exchanges, so-called influence operations, technological innovation issues, a variety of military and security concerns, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, the security operating system, you might say, in the Indo-Pacific region, and really every part of the world. The United States and China are competing for position and influence all across the planet, and even in outer space, in cyberspace, in the Arctic, in the Antarctic. No area of the world is not affected by U.S. China competition. As I say, that is the defining feature of the relationship today: competition, comprehensive competition across all spatial areas worldwide and all functional areas. So this is the defining feature in my mind. I'm not passing judgment, is it good or it's bad? It's just what it is. And we have to recognize it for what it is and deal with it. So should we be worried about the trajectory of relations today after 50 years since Nixon's visit? The answer is absolutely yes. We should be very concerned because the trend line is not very positive. Now, just to conclude, these opening comments, again, we can unpack this. The question is what to do about it, how to manage it. This competition and these frictions. We've had frictions over the last 50 years, but I would submit that they've usually been caused by an event. There have been several events that you're familiar with that we could walk through. And then after the event, there was sort of 2 years or so of stress, and then the relationship got back more or less to one of cooperation and engagement. This time is different. No event has caused the current strains in the relationship. It's systemic, it's deep, as I say, it's broad, and therefore longer lasting. It's the new normal, and it's not going to change, but it has to be managed. It is what I like to say, it's a bad marriage, broken marriage perhaps, but a marriage in which divorce is not an option. You can't just, if you're in a marriage or a relationship, you can't just sort of find a counselor and try and patch things together. There is no counselor in international relations, first of all. And secondly, you can't just say, oh, well, we tried, we had a good X number of years together, let's go our own separate ways. That doesn't work in international relations, and it certainly doesn't work amongst the two of the three leading powers in the world. We can't go our separate ways. In fact, we're bonded together. So we have to learn how to manage our difficulties and our frictions, and look for areas of commonality, mutuality, and cooperation, because they do exist. So this is going to be a relationship of what I call anyway, coopetition, or you might call it competitive coexistence, okay? So competition's here to stay, folks. Don't delude yourself. We're not going back to cooperation, some sort of honeymoon. This is the new normal. So, but it doesn't have to become adversarial. A competitive relationship is not an adversarial relationship. Competition is different than confrontation. Once you get into confrontation, then it can really spin out of control and have all kinds of possible negative military and security consequences. So I'm sure we're going to get into talking about Ukraine tonight as well. But I think that's the kind of overall, where are we 50 years after Nixon went to China and met Chairman Mao and Zhou Enlai? Would they would they have expected the relationship to be where it is today? Probably not. But they couldn't have foreseen how it would grow either. So why don't I stop there and let Professor Sutter give his opening remarks, and we can unpack and dig into all these different dimensions. Okay?
Thank you, Professor Shambaugh. Let's welcome Professor Sutter.
Thanks very much. I'm very happy to be here and have a few minutes to talk with you about something that's, I think it's very serious. So I'm going to be a little more pessimistic than Professor Shambaugh and looking at the situation. And it's based on what I've learned over the past several years in tracking the changes that have taken place in the relationship. And what I see is a pattern in the United States that's quite remarkable. You'll have to remember, and I'm sure you do remember, a few years ago, we had a sense that the engagement was good. We had some differences, but everything was moving forward. To the end of the Barack Obama administration, that seemed to be the case. And then things changed. And the driver is what I'm trying to understand, have been trying to understand. I've studied it, and I'm going to examine it as a government feature. And what you see is that driver is this coalition of forces inside the United States, inside Washington, that come to the judgment that China is a fundamental threat, danger to the United States. And so this understanding emerges. It's been going on now for over 4 years. And it's very strong in the Congress. And I'll give a lot of emphasis to Congress in this talk, because it's the most consistent in pushing this approach. It's the one that's driving it, that keeps it going. You'll find vacillation in the administration, but you won't find it so much you won't find it in the Congress. It's very steady. And so therefore, this is going to continue. So the point is that the change takes place because of American domestic politics and how they respond to the challenges of China. Now they're reacting to ever advancing Chinese challenges. And so my purpose today is to explain the change in American domestic approach to China, domestic policy, and then to talk a bit about why these dangers are seen in the United States. What are these dangers? Why do they exist in the minds of these people? Or why do they exist? And they would talk to them, and this is reality. And so one needs to understand this as well. So China's ever-growing challenges to the United States across a broad array of interests were the target of the Trump administration after 1 year in power. Came up with a strategy, national security strategy, that focused on China in ways that were reminiscent of the Cold War. That document, I had never seen an executive branch document about China in 50 years like that. It was very Cold War type of stuff. And China was the main threat. Russia was the threat, but China was the main threat. But what happened is that in the executive branch, the follow-on will be, first of all, people didn't pay much attention to this in the United States. You may remember, hardly anybody read it. And it wasn't that long, they just didn't read it. But going forward, you find that there was a lot of difference in the administration of how to deal with China from an economic point of view, and big debates within the Trump administration. But there are hardline people like the trade representative and the FBI director and others were very outspoken in dealing with China. And Congress almost immediately understood, and they adopted this kind of approach. They had been feeling this for some time, I guess. And this was bipartisan. Folks, this is unprecedented. You have this very cooperative, bipartisan approach in dealing with China in the Congress, with a very controversial executive branch, and they're together in this very partisan atmosphere in Washington. China does that, apparently. And so what happened was the Congress by 2018 wanted a whole of government approach. The administration take a whole of government approach against the Chinese challenges. And that became a matter of law in August of 2018. And they followed with a whole bunch of other things, and they had all sorts of China provisions in that law. And so this is what they wanted, and they pursued it. The executive branch was pursuing the trade war with China. But then okay, so by 2019, what do we have? Congress is still pursuing these paths, but what is the media doing? It's not paying much attention to this. They're not talking about China as a threat. And they look at Mr. Trump and his trade war, and they say, well, this isn't really very effective. And they focus on him and his vacillation. He's a friend of Xi Jinping. He's an enemy of China. You know, it goes back and forth. And so he's very inconsistent. Congress is very steady. They keep moving forward. In 2019 was the primaries for the Democratic candidates. They hardly said anything about China. It was very low priority. They didn't see China as a danger. Joseph Biden, read what he said in 2019. He said, China, they're not powerful. We're much more powerful than China. That's what he would say repeatedly. And of course, it didn't come up very much. But when it did, that's what he would say. And that was the opinion. Jake Sullivan said in August of 2019, he said, if American public opinion doesn't think that China's a danger, which was true at the case, they didn't. And he said, therefore, we shouldn't pay much attention to it in the campaign. So that was the reality at that time. So how did that change? Well, Congress kept pushing, but the real turning point, of course, came when COVID hit the United States in 2020. And you have this big brouhaha between the administration and China over the source of the virus and so forth, responsibility for the virus and so forth. And that reinforced then public opinion. Then public opinion shifted dramatically against China. And China's ratings in public opinion were the worst they had been since the Cold War, just the Maoist China in the middle of the Cold War. And so this was very strong. And Mr. Trump shifted his approach to not so much wanting a trade deal with China to focusing on China as an opponent and criticizing Biden. And Mr. Biden shifted his position to a much harder position. So it was fairly uniform. Now, when Biden takes office, he comes in and he's facing a whole bunch of efforts on the part of the Trump government to solidify an anti-China position on the part of Mr. Biden, to force him to do this. But he apparently didn't need any forcing. Something happened here with Mr. Biden at this time. And he became very much in line with the mainstream congressional view of China as a danger, as a fundamental danger to the United States. That happened, and he starts speaking like this. He didn't speak like that in December of 2020. He started speaking about that probably in February and March of 2021. And he's been speaking like that ever since. And so this is a remarkable change. And you have his administration, a lot of holdovers from Mr. Obama's administration, who had a very moderate approach to China. They have all changed. Mr. Jake Sullivan, he's changed. And so they have adopted this approach. And you could say they've been pressured by the Republicans. They were in the election, but I think they really believe it now. I think they've been persuaded to join that congressional view. And so we have this momentum behind this effort to counter the challenges that China poses. And so the strategy is to build allies and partners out, to work with them, and then deal with China. And have a strategy to deal with China that builds a position of strength. The United States is trying to build a position of strength to deal with all the challenges that China poses. And so this has broad support in the Congress, and Congress is doing its part. We had a meeting between Mr. Xi Jinping and Mr. Biden in November, long meeting, 3 hours or something like that. And they had a few modest agreements, but basically the situation remains very negative. It continues up to this point. And so the outlook of this kind of situation suggests to me that given these congressional majorities, what you have is a situation where there's a Washington consensus among the policymakers in dealing with this situation this way. Very strong type of approach, trying to deal with China this way. So what I'd like to do now is just talk a little bit about what's at stake. Why? What are the differences that they're so worried about? And here I'm going to have to read my notes because I tried to condense this. Congress is very much an organization that works on pieces. It doesn't really deal with the whole issue. They can't. The jurisdictions are separated and so forth. So they can't come up with a strategy. But what they do is they're countering challenges as they come up. And there's so many of them, these challenges. And so this is a bringing together of all the challenges, trying to describe them, to give everybody an appreciation of how big a danger it is from the point of view of the policymakers in Washington. Over the past 4 years, U.S. government decision makers in the administration and among bipartisan majorities in Congress have shown ever clearer awareness of the challenges posed by China to the interests of the United States and the open world order it supports. First is the challenge posed by over 3 decades of rapid development of Chinese military modern power, tipping the balance in the Indo-Pacific, supporting Chinese territorial expansionism, and undermining U.S. alliances and partnerships in seeking dominance in the region. Number 2, second is the challenge posed by China's similarly long-standing efforts using state-directed development policies. I have to read this, it takes because it's so detailed, to plunder foreign and intellectual property rights and undermine international competitors, having increasingly profound negative impacts on U.S. and Western interests. Beijing does so with hidden and overt state-directed economic coercion, egregious government subsidies, import protection, and export promotion, using highly protected and state-supported products to weaken and often destroy foreign competition in key industries. In this way, it recently seeks dominance in world high technology industries and related military power to displace the United States and secure China's primacy in Asia and world leadership. Third is China's challenge to global governance. More than any other major power, Beijing leverages economic dependence, influence operations, including elite capture and control of important infrastructure to compel deference to its preferences. In the Indo-Pacific region, these practices are backed by intimidating Chinese military power. China's preferences include legitimating the above predatory Chinese economic practices and territorial expansionism, opposition to efforts to promoting accountable governance, human rights, and democracy, opposition to U.S. alliances seen impeding China's rise, and support for the forceful foreign advances of Vladimir Putin's Russia, and the rule of other authoritarian and often corrupt world leaders accountable to their citizens. In this context, 2 fundamental challenges have arisen. One challenge is seen if China captures Asia, if it becomes the leading power of Asia and the U.S. is displaced there, this is going to put the U.S. it's going to be dominated by China. It's judged this way. This is fundamental for American interests. And the second one is the competition in high technology. If China takes over the high technology area, they will take over the industries that are fundamental to American power today, economic power, and America will be second to China in this area. It's not a matter of a prestige thing, it's a matter of substance. And the other part of this is that these industries are so fundamental to the military balance that this will make the Chinese the dominant military power. This driver of this fear, this concern about being dominated by China is the main driving force in the Congress that I see. It comes together this way. And I think it's in the administration and it's in Joseph Biden now. You should look at what he's saying. And so the upshot of this is looking out then, what you see is that we're going to have continued friction. The US is going to counter these challenges. And it's quite an array of challenges. And so this is not going to stop. And the members of Congress are determined to do this. And you look at the Schumer bill and other bills today, and you see this very strong determination. And so the result of this, I'm sorry, I guess I'm going a little long here. I'm going to stop in just a second. But Congress is firm. If the Republicans take the Congress in the next election, they're firmer than the Democrats. So we're going to have a tougher approach. We need a strategy. We don't have a strategy to deal with China. We're dealing with it piecemeal. That's not good. But we're going to continue, this government is going to continue to do that for the foreseeable future. And maybe they'll come up with a strategy that would have an effective approach in dealing with China. So I'm not sure of the efficacy of this approach, how good it will be, but I am sure it's going to continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sutter and Professor Shambaugh. Now we will start our modular question period. So my first follow-up question is to Professor Shambaugh. What are the policies that the Biden administration have inherited from Trump, and what's your explanation of their heritage or some abandoning of the former administration? Thank you.
Okay, so the microphone is working. That's a good thing. Hopefully you heard Tianqi's question, which was what policies, what did the Biden administration inherit from the Trump administration? What continuities and discontinuities do I see, if I understood your question? Well, I see a lot of continuity. One might say that Biden China policies are Trump China policies without Trump. Okay, Trump administration China policies without Trump. And at one level, that's true. I'm going to tell you in a minute how that's also not true. But at the first level, it's taken Trump obviously out of the picture. His bombast, his unpredictability, his ego, his insults that he hurled at China in multiple ways, not the least of which was in the context of COVID. His obsession with, singular obsession with the trade deficit issue. So we all remember the role that Trump himself played. I mean, and as Professor Sutter just said, he had this kind of odd schizophrenia about China. Most of the time he was very hostile to China, but he had this sort of this tendency to talk about his, quote, good friend Xi Jinping, unquote. So if I think Professor Sutter has just laid out very well the policies from the Congress, but the Congress reflects very much it's not just bipartisan policies within Congress, but reflects the consensus in the country and in the foreign policy establishment and with the executive branch in both the Trump and the Biden administration. So other than Russia, which we can get to in a minute, if you're interested, I completely agree with Professor Sutter, there is almost complete agreement about the China challenge, the dimensions of the challenge, the competition, and how to deal with it. I mean, one has to say that there are still I would say, a very small minority of former policymakers who worked on China policy for many decades, over many administrations, who do not agree with this approach. They are still wed to the so-called engagement paradigm. So one has to recognize, I think, because these are not insignificant individuals, I'm not going to name any names, but they do exist. So it's not 100% consensus here in the United States. Maybe I'll stand up so everybody can see better, but it's a 97% consensus. And for the reasons Professor Sutter has just laid out. And the Trump administration really, I agree with him too, that this change in the United States started in the late Obama administration, but the Trump administration really moved the whole of government apparatus, governmentally and in terms of policy, against China. That is so hard to do in any government. It's like moving an ocean liner in an ocean. But the Trump administration did it. It moved all the federal bureaucracy, agencies anyway, against China. So this was very significant, what took place in the 4 Trump years. That's why I would distinguish it between Trump and the Trump administration. Trump was all over the map, but the administration very systematically implemented a series of policies and resourced them with budgets. And when they walked out the door at the end of 4 years, the Biden administration inherited those policies and those budgets, but Trump left. So what you have is considerable continuity between the Trump administration and the Biden administrations. The only difference, I would make two observations about the differences. Number one, the Biden administration is more sophisticated in applying its pushback and its competition against China. The most notable example is in the way the United States works with allies and partners, other countries, vis-a-vis China. The Trump administration did not work with allies and partners vis-a-vis China. The Trump administration was bashing allies and partners over trade issues primarily, but other issues. So the Trump-China policy was actually a rather unilateral policy. It could have very easily been multilateral, multinational, and a big, broad coalition if Trump hadn't been bashing these countries over trade policy. So the Biden administration is very wed to alliance strengthening, partnership strengthening, and dealing with various challenges, not the least of which is Russia and Ukraine right now, but China collectively. So Biden's administration is filled with a number of Europe specialists, starting with the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, all the way down. And they look at China. How do they look at China? They look across the Atlantic Ocean at China. You might think, what's he talking about? The Biden administration looks to Europe, looks to the G7, looks to other democracies to mobilize them against China and to deal with various China policies. So that's what I mean by more sophisticated. There's a coalitional approach. Second difference is the Trump administration has to be said to have been confrontational towards China. And oh, it really was in every issue area in China's face. Well, this administration is not confrontational, it's competitive. It's toned down the rhetoric, the bombast, the hyperbole, and the insults, fortunately. But it hasn't changed the substance of the policies. But it has replaced the confrontation paradigm with a competition paradigm and is trying to resource that competition in a variety of ways, including domestically here inside the United States, as the president spoke about last night in the State of the Union address. So I would say that essentially it's a continuation from Trump administration to Biden administration, but with greater sophistication and less, hyperbolic rhetoric.
Thank you, Professor Shambaugh, for providing us the nuanced differences between Biden and Trump. Now, a follow-up question to Professor Sutter. How does Washington perceive the current gap between China and United States in terms of national strength? How do you see this gap changing in the near future? If you need a podium, you can come.
Press it. Yeah, I'd like to sit. This is fine. Okay, great. We're on now. Okay, great. Well, as I tried to explain in my remarks, you get a sense of the danger of dominance, and the danger of dominance comes from military dominance in Asia and the Pacific, tipping the balance, allowing China to expand at the expense of others, including the United States, and the other one is on the economic competition. Where China, in the high technology area, where China applies this heavy state-directed type of approach to pursue its advances in high technology, which will dominate the industries that are most important to the United States at this point, and would dominate the industries that are most important for the U.S. military at this point. So those are the two things that they worry about. Now, should they be worried about it? That's another question. When you look at this, I'm not so worried. I'm not as worried as they are at this point, but I don't know. And then you don't know. I want to explain this a little bit. I did work in intelligence for a while, and I could never, and I had a fairly senior position dealing with China, and I knew China's military capacities pretty well. I had a pretty good handle on that. I didn't know American military capacities, and you don't know either. The United States keeps these things really secret. I mean, the things that really matter. And these are, am I talking about magic weapons? And well, maybe, yeah. Approaches for dealing with military situations are something that the US does all the time. And so the upshot of this is that I can't judge this. I can say, okay, I can look at the balance in the military sense. And then in the high technology sense, how do you know if you're ahead in high technology? This stuff hasn't even been invented. If you have an arms race with somebody, you can look at their missiles, look at your missiles, and you can come to some judgment, say, I'm secure, I've got enough missiles to handle this thing. In high technology, you don't have that. And now that we're really in this high technology competition, you're not going to feel comfortable and safe as a country until you dominate. Only then you'll feel comfortable, if you see what I mean. So there's something inherent in this kind of competition, which makes it really escalate, and you have to work doubly hard. Do you get my point? And you're never going to be sure that you've got it right. So this is something that so this argues for very strong competition, to say the least, in the high technology area.
Thank you, Professor Sutter. And indeed, as scholars, we tend to be more prudent and cautious when making those statements. However, Congress has moved well beyond our prediction. They have seen China, perceived the rise of China as a threat. And recently, Congress has introduced several bills aiming to strengthen America's competitiveness, such as the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act of 2021, the Fair Trade with China Enforcement Act. Can you provide an overview of the role that Congress plays in the China policy making process and the scope of congressional legislations addressing China-related issues? Both of you are welcome to answer this.
Okay, I'll stop. Try that. Am I on? Oh, I am on. Okay. Folks, I'm writing a book now on Congress and China policy. There's never been a period like this. Congress the Constitution gives the president primary power in foreign affairs. And that's always been the case. But sometimes the Congress has asserted itself in various ways. And you saw this most recently after Tiananmen. The Congress asserted itself there. The Taiwan Relations Act. I'm sure this audience knows all about the Taiwan Relations Act. That was a pushback by Congress. But it doesn't last. As Professor Shambaugh pointed out, these frictions don't last very long. This one has gone on for 4 years, over 4 years now. And as I predict, it's going to continue. It's going to be very strong for the foreseeable future. Why? Well, the challenges grow. Xi Jinping is not changing. He's not giving in. He's not compromising. He continues to do all these things that I just mentioned on governance, in economic policies, and in national security, in security in Asia. He continues along these paths, and I don't think he will stop. And so the result is, this is what the result is going to be. And this is a bipartisan issue in Congress. And so you have a situation where the continuity, therefore, is pretty much guaranteed. And it's unprecedented. It's never been seen before. In the past, Congress usually would be united in pushing back against the administration. They were doing something and the Congress would push back. George H.W. Bush was too soft on China after Tiananmen, so they pushed back on that in reaction to Tiananmen. The TRA went too far on Taiwan. The administration went too far on Taiwan, so they pushed back with the TRA. But this is something where the administration and the Congress are together. So the momentum here, I think, is quite strong.
Professor Shambaugh, you want to take this or move on? Okay, no problem. Certainly, there are a lot of frictions between China and the US, not only in the realms of high tech and economics, but we recently see a rise of military escalations in the Indo-Pacific and to some degree, strategic deterrence. Can you explain the nature of US-China security dilemma in the Indo-Pacific or strategic deterrence at large? What are the two countries' strengths and weaknesses in the Indo-Pacific and in their strategic deterrence? Anyone want to take this?
I'll take a start on that. Well, if the question is, what is the comparative balance of power, security balance of power between the United States and China in Asia, we have to unpack that a little bit. You ask what are the strengths and the weaknesses. Well, I would start with partners and alliances. First of all, the United States has far more alliances and partners than does China in Asia, not to mention the world. In Asia, the United States has 5 formal treaty allies and a number of very close security partners, namely Singapore, Vietnam, and India. None of those 3 are allies. The allies are, of course, Australia, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Thailand. How many allies does China have? None. None. Only 1 treaty partner, North Korea. With friends like that, so you just have to start, and what countries are aligned with China in Asia, closely aligned? I'm not talking about being trade partners, I'm talking about strategic alignment. I can think of 1.5. Number 1, Cambodia. The half is Myanmar. No other country in Asia that is strategically close to China at all. They all keep their distance from China. Yes, they trade with China. They have cultural exchanges with China. They have students that come back and forth between China. They have a lot of tourists, Chinese tourists, 20 million a year before COVID that would go to Southeast Asia alone, and about 10 million Chinese tourists that would go to South Korea alone, and Australia. Anyway, there's a lot of interaction between China and Asian societies. That's not the point. The point is in terms of strategic alignment. So I would argue, if you're asking about strengths and weaknesses, at least by that metric, America has multiple more strengths than does China. And then if you look at a kind of the military balance of power, first of all, you have to compare the American military to the Chinese military in Asia. Both sides have some strengths and both sides have some weaknesses. The biggest weakness for the United States is what's known as the tyranny of distance. It's a long way across the Pacific Ocean, even from Hawaii, where the Indo-Pacific Command is based. But the United States has close to 100,000 forward deployed troops in Asia on land and at sea 365 days a year, and forward deployed military assets in a number of countries, those that I just named, the 5 allies plus Singapore. So, so I would, but China is a very powerful military. The PLA has come a very long way in a variety of weapon systems and defensive capabilities. I wouldn't recommend trying to attack or invade China. Not a good idea. You're not going to get very far. But even in terms of offshore defense, the so-called first and second island chain, China has developed what's known as A2AD, anti-access area denial capacity out to the second island chain. That means it's highly risky for any foreign military to come to try and wage war inside the second island chain. Risky, I said, not impossible, just risky. You're going to lose some of your ships and some of your planes. Doesn't mean you can't wage war, but it's not going to be easy. So China has come a long way in its own growth of its own military power. But last point is the South China Sea and Taiwan. Okay, these are the 2 security flashpoints in the region, each of which we could spend a very long time talking about. I think you understand pretty much the nature of each of those dilemmas, security dilemmas, and they're not going away. They have to be managed. To get back to my original comments about how to manage competition, you have to accept the competition and then build walls and barriers and guardrails and buffers and things around the tension points. Because if you don't do that, war can actually erupt. And it can erupt through accidents. 2 fighter planes run into each other, 2 submarines run into each other, 2 ships run into each other. Accidents can trigger war. And unfortunately, in the U.S. China relationship, there are no agreements between the 2 countries as there was between the former Soviet Union and the United States during Cold War 1.0. So the potential of an accident in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait is not insignificant. That's what keeps me awake at night. It's worrying. So that's how I would, sort of give a relative balance of power in Asia. I think America's hand is very strong, and China's hand is not very strong, frankly, in the region, and particularly in Southeast Asia. My last book I wrote about was U.S. and China in Southeast Asia. China has economic strength, it has people-to-people strength. That's about it. That's it. No soft power, no real diplomatic influence, no foreign bases, no deployed soldiers, no alliances, no partners, and no real friends, except Cambodia, which is like a client state. It's almost 31st province of the People's Republic of China. So, I actually see China as pretty weak, relatively speaking, and the United States is quite strong.
Thank you, Professor Shambaugh, for your analysis. You're speaking of China's relative disadvantage in the region, and but also the shadow of war is looming. Despite China having the disadvantage, what do you see as the main challenges preventing the installation of a de-escalation mechanism between U.S. and China in South China Sea and Taiwan Straits, given that China has a relative disadvantage, but still wanting to assert its power in the region?
Yeah, I'd like to say a few things. I've written a lot of books dealing with China's rise in Asia, and I felt it was really silly to think that the Chinese could take over Asia and displace the United States. I believed that for about 15 years. I don't believe it anymore for some reason. I'm just going to give you some markers here that I'd like to point out. And so then we have to investigate. Well, what's changed here? You see, and it's hard to figure it out. But number one, in 2010, the United States was able to challenge China in the South China Sea at the ARF meeting, and it had about maybe 12 countries aligned with it. And they did the same thing. And they challenged China in its bullying in the South China Sea, which is just getting underway at that point. That doesn't happen anymore. Nothing like that happens. The Southeast Asian countries won't take any position dealing with China that would be controversial with China. Even Vietnam. Vietnam is very careful not to do something that would antagonize China. And so this is a remarkable change. And we need to investigate, well, why has this happened? And then just the facts on the ground. What happened in the South China Sea? The Chinese had a claim, and they went in and they built their islands and they fortified them, and they're using them all the time. And what happened in response? Did anybody in Southeast Asia get very upset about this? I'm sure they were, in some cases. I think the Philippines said a few things, but not much. Vietnamese said a few things, but not much. And the Chinese carry out their coercive activities, and it's all very incremental. It's all very little steps. not Putin. They're not like Putin, thank goodness. But we'll just cross the borders and go after them. It's all very, we call it death by 1,000 cuts in the old days. This is what's happening here. And so I think it's made advances. And I can't quite figure it out, what the cause of it is. But we know that the Chinese statecraft is full of hidden things that you don't see, things that influence people in various ways, mobilize people in various ways, have government pressures that don't involve the government. You see, they're done by seemingly secret organizations, or they're done by people. But these people are motivated in some ways to do these sorts of things. And so when I add up the balance sheet in China and Asia today, in the United States and China today, I see that China has overplayed its hand, and Japan, India, and Australia are obviously very alienated from China. They share this danger that the US has about China, and they're working with the United States to do this sort of thing. I find South Korea is on the fence in a lot of issues, vacillates back and forth. And I think if we had a conservative leader in South Korea, it wouldn't be on the fence so much, but we don't. We have a progressive, and so it's going to be on the fence. And then in Southeast Asia, as David said, the Chinese, these folks don't say much against China. David, in his book, said the Chinese have a veto power on these problems. Well, the veto power reflects power realities. Why don't these countries speak up on China in all sorts of issues? It's not just the South China Sea, it's all sorts of issues. They don't. They're happy to criticize the United States, but they don't criticize China. And the US ability to compete with China in a place like Southeast Asia has eroded. It's widely seen that the US is in decline in that area. And so this is and is Biden changing that? Well, he's trying to, but it's hard. And meanwhile, China has a lot of advantages in going forward as far as influence is concerned. So if you depict Asia as a place that will, David is right, they're not allies of China, they're client states. They move to be client states. They're not technically client states, but they're dependent on China. And China uses that dependence, that leverage, to get what they want. And the US doesn't have that. US doesn't operate that way. First of all, it's very hard to operate that way. And secondly, it doesn't have the leverage. It's not prepared to use the leverage, and it can't do these things in secret. They could. I mean, US CIA can do these kinds of things, but the point is they don't. And the Congress won't allow them, I guess. I'm not sure. Maybe it's not warranted. But the upshot of this is Southeast Asia is very much in play. I think China's got the upper hand in Southeast Asia right now. And so if you look at the important countries along the rim, I don't count Central Asia as all that important in this instance, and Russia is obviously on China's side. But the others are very important in the balance in the region. Japan, Australia, and India, very much on the US side. Southeast Asia in play. South Korea, not so sure. We hope they stay close. And we're working, and the US government is working on that. So that's where we are right now, it seems to me. And what the countries in the region worry about a lot is that the US is not predictable. It's unreliable. And they may be right. We had a very unreliable president from 2017 to 2021. And he just was all over the lot. And he was harsh to these countries in various ways. And Biden is much different, very traditional sort of alliance relationship. Well, he may not be president in 2025. He may lose the election in 2024. And who's going to be the president? Good old you know what. Yeah, well, I mean, that's what people were saying in 2016, David. It will never happen. Well, if that happens, the Southeast Asian countries and others say we can't count on the United States. And we've got the same problem we had with Mr. Trump in earlier. So all of these things make me a little concerned, and this is to the advantage of China. China is very consistent, very consistent. Positive incentives, negative incentives, and they all know what those are.
Well, I'm anxious to have question and answer and dialogue with the audience, actually. I think there are probably a lot of questions that want to be asked. I could add on to what Professor Sutter said about Southeast Asia. I have slightly different views, but that's okay. Why don't we move, unless you have you have one more question you wanted to ask? Okay, go ahead, Tianqu.
Thank you, Professor Sutter, for your remarks. And now we're moving on to our last question. 2022 is a decisive year for both China and the US. The two countries will experience a shift of political power and factionalism within their domestic institutions. So to what degree will the upcoming US midterm election and the 20th Party Congress in China impact the future policies of the bilateral relations? Sir Shambaugh, you want to take this?
Yeah, okay, I'll do the midterms. The Republicans might win. And if they win, there'll be a tougher China policy in the Congress. It'll be tougher. It's amazing. You have these America firsters in the Republican Party, the large group of sort of isolationist type of thing. And some of them like Putin, this kind of thing. You've probably read about that. But in the end of the day, though, they all don't like China. Doesn't matter if they're America firsters or not. And so the Republicans taking over, they're much tougher toward China as far as what they would propose. And so I would predict that not only would it endure this approach endure, it would probably accentuate to some degree.
Well, the outcome of the 20th Party Congress I can predict is that the Chinese Communist Party will win. There's no question about that. And there's little question about whether Xi Jinping will continue to be the leader of China. Of course, he could stay on anyway as the General Secretary of the Communist Party because there's no term limit on that position. There's no term limit on the chairmanship of the Central Military Commission. There was a term limit on the presidency of the nation, but he removed that term limit, as I'm sure you know. So he's opened the door for indefinite rule. Some people like to say he's leader for life. I don't think anything is predictable in Chinese politics, including whether a leader will rule for the rest of their lives. I think there are a lot of unpredictable elements actually in Chinese politics that we can discuss if you're interested. But assuming that that Xi Jinping doesn't slip in the bathtub or have a health incident between now and November, he will preside over the 20th Party Congress, and he will give a very important speech at the 20th Party Congress that is being written right now already. We have a sense of who's actually drafting the speech, but what we don't quite know is what's going to be in it yet. We won't really find that out until November. I would anticipate, so he's going, coming out of the Congress, he's going to have an even more strengthened hand than he already has. And his hand is pretty strong and has been made stronger over the past year because of the 100th anniversary of the party last July and the 6th plenum in November and the history resolution that was published just after the plenum. So he holds all the key reins of power. China has not had a leader as powerful as Xi Jinping since Mao. Xi Jinping is stronger than Deng Xiaoping was by some measure, I would argue. So at one level, he's really in control. But we know that there's a considerable amount of discontent throughout the society with his rule. How that becomes, will that change anything? No, I don't anticipate it changing anything. Discontent is not the same thing as opposition, and certainly not organized opposition, but there is a lot of discontent, we know that. Nonetheless, he will be the ruler after November. And depending what he says in his speech, I think that the tensions in U.S. China relations are likely to go up, and particularly over Taiwan. I would anticipate that Xi Jinping will give a timeline or a time frame for the so-called reunification of Taiwan with the mainland. Whether he's going to say it has to happen by 2035 or by 2030 or 2049, that's unclear. And I'm not sure he's going to put a date on it, but the clock is ticking as far as Xi Jinping is concerned. And I think we're going to see, it's just my guess, coming out of the Congress, that he's going to accelerate the ticking of the clock. And he's going to increase pressures on Taiwan. And that's going to cause huge tensions in the U.S. China relationship, as if we don't already have enough tensions in the U.S. China relationship. So, ladies and gentlemen, hold on to your chairs, buckle your seatbelts after November. I hope I'm wrong about that concerning Taiwan, but that's my sense. So why don't we go to audience questions?
Thank you for your response. Now we will start our audience. Henry, you first.
Thank you, Aiden.
Just keep it short. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Dr. Shambaugh and Dr. Sutter, for your amazing remarks. And yeah, my name is Henry Tsai, and I'm affiliated with the U.S. CSO. And as a Taiwanese, I'm just wondering. Let me frame it this way. Taiwanese watching what's happening in Ukraine is giving us a lot of anxiety over, potential situation associated with a Chinese invasion. And, as what Dr. Sutter said, people is questioning the U.S. reliability. And, Taiwanese is obviously having a lot of thoughts about U.S. reliability, although our president is trying to assure us that the U.S. will be very supportive of Taiwan in case of a Chinese invasion. And I'm just wondering, the U.S. very much embraced a policy of strategic ambiguity in its Taiwan Relations Act. I'm just wondering if it's time for the U.S. to end that strategic ambiguity in order to send a stronger signals to Taiwan and its other allies in Asia that the U.S. presence will be there and the U.S. will be involved.
Okay. Yeah, I'm an old timer. We've been dealing with the Taiwan crisis for 70 years. The U.S. government has been having to deal with this issue very seriously for 70 years. And so strategic ambiguity is where it works for the United States up to a point. When you start getting clarity, you undermine the one China policy, you really alienate Beijing. And for what? I think if you look at the record, what the U.S. government and the Trump and the Biden administration has done vis-a-vis Taiwan, I was talking about China's incremental advances in Southeast Asia. They've been doing incremental advances with Taiwan. Security, economic, diplomatic. Strongest support I've seen for Taiwan since the break in official relations, and even before then. So this is an unprecedented U.S. support for Taiwan. People in Taiwan, I may not know this, but I think the government certainly knows this and appreciates it. And so this is so different than Ukraine, where Mr. Biden was saying, "Oh, we're not going to get in there." Mr. Biden, have you noticed when he slips up, he says, if Beijing attacks Taiwan, we're going to help Taiwan. Did you notice that? He said that more than once. He just keeps doing these kinds of things. Did you know that Bernie Sanders said this? He was asked, he said, if Beijing attacks Taiwan, should the U.S. use military force to help Taiwan? He said, yes. Bernie Sanders. I mean, goodness, very left-leaning senator. And so the result is you have this very strong support for Taiwan. And so why do you want to mess it up? Let the policymakers manage it. I mean, you can say, oh, they don't know what they're doing. I think they really do know what they're doing. I think they're really doing a great job. Let that continue. And signing one understands this. Let that continue so they can advance the relationship in a way that doesn't fundamentally lead to a blow up with Beijing. That's not in Taiwan's interest to have a blow up with Beijing. They don't want that. So let's do that. And let's keep doing it. And I think we can. I think we can. I don't think Beijing is going to attack anytime soon.
Thank you. Next question.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Dae Lee. I took both of your professor's class previously, and I'm deeply appreciative of that. Like in last year, Bob Woodward published a book, Puro, in which he described after January 6th, and the Chinese believe that an U.S. attack is imminent, and General Milley called the chief of staff of PLA of General Li Zuocheng to mitigate this sort of a crisis and gave a reassurance of U.S. intention. What do you think is the future of U.S. China crisis mitigation, crisis control mechanism? Do you see progress coming, or we are backsliding?
I think we need to build a lot stronger crisis management mechanisms, is the short answer. We don't have them. Yes, you can always pick up the telephone, as General Milley did, at that point in time, but the phone isn't always answered on the other end. 没有人接, right? The United States has called China a few times, more than once. 没有人接. I'm serious. And so there are some so-called hotlines between the White House and the Zhongnan High, and between the Indo-Pacific Command and the Nanjing Military Command, and between the two navies, but they're not always active. And it's unclear. And so we don't have any real conflict control, de-escalation, or management mechanisms between the two militaries and the two national governments that are what they were between the Soviet Union and the United States. This is where I think we need to go back and look at Cold War 1.0 and dust off a few of the elements that maintained strategic stability during Cold War 1.0 for the current situation. But the problem is the Chinese side says, 不要. We don't want to even talk about it. Why is a mystery to us Americans. We have been trying for several administrations, since Bush 43, all the way through Obama. I don't know about the Trump administration, but now the Biden administration, to try and institute these kinds of communications channels with the People's Liberation Army at the various highest levels, and with the Chinese Communist Party at the various highest levels. 他们不要. They don't want it. 为什么? I don't know, but that's not very conducive to stability and to China's own national defense and security. So, I think the Chinese need to kind of rethink this question in order to maintain their own national security and stability, because an accident, as I described earlier, can happen tomorrow. We're just lucky it hasn't happened, but it could happen tomorrow, and then what happens? So I'm very concerned about it. The American side is extremely concerned about this. And it's the Chinese side who refuses, for some mysterious reason that is not clear at all, to enter into discussions, much less establish such mechanisms. So I put the blame on the Chinese side on this question.
Thank you. I think we have a question earlier from this side. Yes.
Thank you so much for your remarks. My name is Elad Raymond. I work with the Onera Institute, which is a partner of US CISO, so it's so great to be here today. And I especially appreciated your review of the alignment across Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia as well. And one country that wasn't mentioned that I think was pretty interesting because of its history with the US and with China more and more is Pakistan. And so one thing I want to ask you is, how do shifting dynamics in South Asia, particularly when it comes to Pakistan, and also, as you mentioned, with India's shift much more into the side of the U.S. in recent years? How does that impact the continuation of U.S.-China relations in Asia? Thank you.
Pakistan is China's all-weather friend. It's the only country in the world, I believe, that has been an all-weather friend. You can't even say that about North Korea, who has been close to an all-weather friend. So, it's a very close partner of China's, always has been. And it is a nuclear power because China gave it the capability. We know that, the Haqqani network. So that's one manifestation of the all-weather friend relationship. Does that mean China will defend Pakistan? It doesn't have a treaty or an alliance. And in previous encounters with India, China did not come to Pakistan's defense. So that's an open question. I don't know. I don't think Pakistan is a major variable in the U.S.-China relationship. India is a significant variable. And as you indicated in your question, India has grown increasingly close to the United States in recent years. And the Quad, which we haven't mentioned tonight, which is now being really activated under the Biden administration, is a significant new development. So the balance of power, in terms of the U.S.-China position in South Asia, is fluid because in addition to India and Pakistan, there are several other countries, Nepal, the Maldives, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. And in each of those four cases, China has been very, very active in trying to cultivate support from those four, mainly to surround India. That's China's, you may ask, what is China's goal in South Asia? Surround India, contain India, restrain India. That's China's preference. So Pakistan and these other countries, they're tools in China's own containment policy towards India is the way I read it.
Okay. One more question from this side, please.
Thank you, professors. I really appreciate it. One of the diplomatic phrase that is often used between the U.S.-China relations is dealing with China from a position of strength, and I wonder how that looks like in practice. Does that mean dealing with China unequally, and how do you think that will help the U.S.-China relations going forward, or backlash on U.S.-China relations?
The need for strength is because you're challenged. The need for strength is because you feel you're very challenged, and so you're looking for strength. You're looking for leverage. You're looking for ways, tools that can help you to deal with this kind of a situation. And the Trump administration tried to go it alone, and that didn't work very well. The U.S. was in decline in Asia after the 4 years of Trump. So it didn't work very well. But so the Biden people are trying to use a more systematic, a very traditional type of American approach to rely on allies, work with partners, this type of thing. And they're doing that in the Asia Pacific region. And so the rationale is, if we don't do this, we're going to be dominated. But we have to do it. And so I think that's a crude justification, but I think that sort of sums it up. And so they're at that stage where you have to then compete that way. And so backlash, it doesn't matter. You're at a position where you have to defend yourself. And so that's the Washington perspective. That's a Washington perspective, which is prevalent in the Congress, and I think it's heavily in the administration too. So that's what we're trying to do in this kind of a situation, is to say, how do we defend ourselves against these dangers? And this is one element that is used to do that.
But if I could just add, if a country is strong and secure, they don't need to tell others that they are strong and secure. I don't think, and many others don't think, it was appropriate for Anthony Blinken to meet Yang Jiechi in Alaska and say, we are going to deal with you from a position of strength. We are strong. That's not necessary. That's provocative in my view, and it didn't need to be said. If the Americans are strong, the Chinese know that. Everybody else knows that. You don't need to tell somebody else that you're stronger than them. That's just waving a red. That's insulting, and it's waving a red flag in front of a bull. So Yang Jiechi had to defend himself, and he pushed back big time. If you watch that, so I think the rhetoric is important in international relations. What you say and how you say it. So the Biden administration has modulated its rhetoric since then. That's how they started off. Blinken, Wendy Sherman, goes to Tianjin. She tells Wang Yi, "We're going to deal with you from a position of strength." You've noticed since then, they haven't used that. They've decided that that's not a good way to talk to China. What are they saying instead? Managing competition responsibly. That's the new TIFA. That's the new Kohao. That's the new slogan. That's the new narrative. Manage competition responsibly. Now that's a lot more rational and honest and gives the Chinese side something to respond to. Well, yes, let's manage this competition responsibly together. It's much better, I think, than saying we're stronger than you and we're going to proceed in our relationship on that basis. That was not a very smart way to approach China, I think, in my own opinion.
Thank you. I can only take one more question.
Hello. Thank you, Professor Sutter and Professor Shambaugh. So my question is, how do we talked about preventing that there's a difference between competition and confrontation. I think the war in the Korean War is a great example of the United States kind of poking the bear in terms of the United States under MacArthur decided to push the North Koreans all the way up to the Chinese border, even though that was, China relayed that it was a vital security interest that there was a buffer between China and the US. So given that, it might be important that we take into account China's vital security interests and not poke the bear, how do we go about that when it comes to the South China Sea or Taiwan? How do we accommodate China's vital security interests while managing competition and managing our alliances and assurance?
I'd like to say something about that. I just think the perception in Washington today is that they've been taking advantage of us. China's been taking advantage of us in these respective areas for years. And that is, so you go to the Chinese and say, oh, we want to reassure you at this point. I think that just doesn't cut a lot of ice right now. I think there's a sense that, no, we have to get them to stop first. Stop these challenges somehow. And you can say, well, maybe then you can reassure them. Okay, that's fine. But the point is the dynamic, I think, as seen by, this is a perspective here, that, you say they've been advancing in the South China Sea, doing all these things that they've been doing, and advancing in other places, and threatening Taiwan. And so what do we do? And you're saying, well, you should assure them. And I think that's, yes, you should. I mean, I think that's right. You're going to have to do that at some point. But the point is, I don't think that you're going in proposition, if you see what I mean. And yet, I'm not sure what can result from that. But I think I'm trying to explain the logic of what I think is behind it.
I agree. You don't need to assure, you need to deter China in these two cases. And if you don't do that, there will be continued incremental expansionism and threats, not just to Taiwan and those other claimant countries in South China Sea, but to other countries in Southeast Asia and potentially in Northeast Asia as well. So I don't think assurance is the right way to approach this. Assurance is almost like appeasement at a certain point in time. And you look at the Ukrainian situation, we can all do Monday morning quarterbacking and look back at what should have been done differently. Should markers have been, the West NATO have tolerated the grabbing of Crimea and the cutting off of the two regions in the east of Ukraine. No, they didn't react, didn't do anything. Few sanctions, but no real impact. And now we have what we have. So, there comes a time in the strategic world and in national security where you don't just assure, you deter, and you draw lines and you respond.
Thank you very much for your time, and I learned a lot from your wisdom and your knowledge, and my sincere apology to those who I cannot call upon but having a question. And now we're gonna end our conference. Thank you very much, and thank you for coming.
All right. Hello. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I can confidently say that we have a lot to take away from tonight's discussion. Can we have one more round of applause for Professor Sutter, Professor Shambaugh, and Tianqu, please? Thank you. Before we end our program, I would like to make a couple of acknowledgements and announcements. First, thank you all for taking the time to join us again tonight. As a young organization, we are honored to have the opportunity to host this space, and for all of us to learn more about U.S. China relations, and are very humbled to have all of you here with us tonight. I would also like to thank Professor Shambaugh and Professor Sutter for taking the time to speak with us today and to share their insights on this very crucial time in U.S. China relations. Thank you to Tianqu for moderating tonight's discussion, to all our volunteers here from the U.S. CISO, and special thanks to U.S. CISO co-founder Zach Rosenfeld, who is on the live stream from Amsterdam, who made a lot of tonight's initial preparations, and Meta Prasanna for all her support and guidance throughout this process. Looking forward, we welcome you to join us as you continue promoting analytical and student-centered discourse on U.S.-China relations here at GW. As you can see on the screen here, you'll see QR codes that will lead you to the US CISO website, where you can register for our upcoming events, check out our research, and subscribe to our newsletters. With that said, I would like to thank everybody for coming tonight. With the final round of applause for our speakers tonight, I would like to bid you all good night. Thank you.